Hello and welcome back to my channel, and today I'm going to be counting down my top 10 movies by Yasujiro Ozu. Now, many years ago, when Tower Records was still part of Piccadilly Circus tube station, remember that? I was browsing around buying some DVDs, got what I wanted, went up to the counter, and the guy across the counter, he looked at the DVDs and he went, Japanese cinema enthusiast, eh? Like Kurosawa? And I went, no, not really. And he went, Mizoguchi. And I went, no, Ozu. And then he went, oh, and stopped talking to me. A lot of people feel that way about Ozu. Everyone knows that he's supposed to be one of the greatest filmmakers ever. I would say, along with Carl Dreyer, the greatest filmmaker ever. But most people, they stop short with Tokyo Story, don't they? They know that Tokyo Story is one of the 10 best films ever made, so they watch Tokyo Story, think it's very nice, and then they never watch another Ozu film for their entire lives. Why? Well, they have this impression that all Ozu's films are the same, right? This is something that goes through, this is a reputation he has. So most people don't bother after Tokyo Story. They think they've seen Ozu. They watch loads of Kurosawa, they watch loads of Mizoguchi, but they only bother with Tokyo Story. And a lot of people are a bit put off by this image of, Ozu as just making family dramas. I remember I had this same problem myself when I first encountered Ozu. I'd become a member of the BFI, the National Film Theatre in London, and an Ozu season came on, and I heard that he was this great director. So I booked loads of tickets. And the first night, I went to see a film called The Brothers and Sisters of the Toda Family that he made in 1940. Very good film. It's one of the lesser-known Ozus, but it's very good. Anyway, and I thought, I'd invited some friends along. We've got to see this important director. So the night comes, and we're knee-deep in the rows. So it's not like if you don't like a film, you can walk out. We've got about 8 people between us and the aisles. The film starts. It's quite hot in the auditorium. And for the first hour, I'm sitting there thinking, oh my God, what is this? Just loads of Japanese people being nice to each other. I was so used to Western cinema, so used to conflict and dysfunction and easy narrative, hits and twists and turns, that all these people just being nice to each other in rooms, sitting, talking to each other. I was kind of like, I felt trapped. I felt imprisoned, and I was looking around, seeing that people are enjoying it, But I couldn't get out because there was too many people, right? And I was with my friends, and I was a bit embarrassed. So I stayed. And slowly I got into the rhythm of it, the tempo of it, how it was working. And the emotion of it started to roll like a snowball downhill, And by the end of it, I didn't want it to finish. And next time I went back and watched Late Spring, which I think is one of the supreme masterpieces of world cinema, and I absolutely fell in love. And since then, I've watched every single extant Ozu film. Some of his early films have been lost, but I've watched pretty much all the others, and there are about 50 of them. And then, years later, I got a job writing DVD reviews for a DVD sell-through company called Movie Mail. And Movie Mail used to publish this little bulletin full of reviews of DVDs. And I used to write for them. And I became their Ozu guy because no one else wanted to write about Ozu. And so I wrote every single, release from the BFI of Ozu. I wrote the review of it for that paper because no one else wanted to write for them. What is it about Ozu that puts people off? Well, what Ozu trades in is what's called shomin-geki. Now, this is a genre in Japanese cinema that's to do with family life, family troubles. Ozu mostly worked for Shochiku, this studio, and they produced these many shomin-geki, and they were called Ofuna flavor, right? And this was named after the town in which they moved some of their studios. But it's a sort of bittersweet, nice, cozy, but it's a flavour that's filled with sort of a sense of sadness and melancholy, right? There's a classic line, very famous line from Ozu, where one character turns to another and says, "Isn't life disappointing?" And the other character just goes, "Yes." And that sums up that sort of Ofuna flavour. Little aside here, recent commentators on Ozu have felt that translation into English isn't strong enough, that actually the Japanese is a bit harder than disappointing, but you get the idea. And Ozu himself said he was like a tofu maker. So, his whole idea about his films was not grand and not grandiloquent. These are a low-key family dramas. And what happens in Ozu is this. You get this family, this group. Sometimes they're a complete nuclear family. Sometimes it's a widower living with his daughter or whatever. And they live quite a nice, cosy life. And we're introduced into the everyday world at a nice, even tempo. And into this very sort of bland, seemingly bland, everyday world comes a problem. The eldest daughter might need to be married. The mother is getting ill or whatever. And this problem introduces a new point of tension into the family that eventually becomes something bigger and bigger and bigger. And eventually it reaches a crisis, and then it's resolved. But the resolution is never quite as happy as it was before. There's a realization by all the people involved that life is disappointing, right? So what we're looking at here is a kind of family drama which has become unfashionable, if we're honest, in the West. That's done in this kind of bittersweet tempo. And what also, I think, puts people off Ozu is that he makes it in a very rigorous, almost art house style. So it's popular cinema, right? It's made for big audiences, and Ozu is well known in Japan, and he was highly watched, right? He wasn't some sort of remote figure. He was a popular filmmaker, but he's very rigorous in his styling. So often with conversations between characters, he has them in sort of medium frame, face on. So you get, cut, shot, reverse shot, just looking straight into the camera. He films, as I said, the space isn't filmed with nice tracking shots and elaborate shots, but almost sort of geometric, almost like Mondrian planes, And there's a sort of rigor, you almost sort of want to break out of it, when you first encounter it. And he also uses these kind of punctuation shots. So we have a conversation between some people, and then he'll go to 3 little shots of different aspects of the countryside around them, which are, in narrative terms, totally unconnected, right? But they give a sort of poetic flavour. You could almost say they're a visual haiku. Now, a lot of critics, I've noticed, treat these punctuation shots as like a sort of directorial flourish, a bit like calligraphy, like how someone writes their Y's or their G's. I think it's something more than that. I think those punctuation shots are an integral part of the film. And I think they really colour and sort of, complement the way we see the narrative and the emotions that are evolving in the narrative. So you see what I mean? Like, for a Western audience, they're a rather strange, perhaps forbidding proposal, a bittersweet family drama done at a very low key. What Ozu is excavating is the emotions of everyday life, of all of us, in a way that is accessible to every single audience member. Whether you like art house films or Spielberg or genre movies, anyone can relate to Ozu, right? And yet it's done with the most thorough rigour of any art house director. And that to me is fascinating. I don't think there's any director who's quite done that, really, in the history of the medium. Now, this unusual style of Ozu has upended a lot of modern critics. They don't really know how to write about him, And there's been this argument raging about Ozu that I find really interesting. Is he a traditionalist or is he a radical? And of course, what they're saying is he seems to concentrate on the Japanese family. And there is a small c conservativeness going on there, right? He seems to celebrate the family. And he's always restores the family. Whatever the conflict, the family gets restored at the end. So is he a traditionalist? Or is he a radical? Because he's constantly attacking the family. He's constantly showing how it can be a trap and how it can be dysfunctional. Well, of course, like all great artists, he's both and neither. He is not a traditionalist because he's always pointing out the problems in the family, and he's watching how the family is changing in the post-war American-occupied Japan. But he's also not a radical, because he likes the family. He's not like a modern leftist who sees the nuclear family as the source of all ills. He likes the family, and he sees it as a haven. And, it's interesting to me that modern critics can't accept that someone can have a traditionalist love and sentimentality along with a critical sensibility. Those two things can coexist, and that's part of, I think, Ozu's greatness. That's all very well, but what's the real core of Ozu's films? The real inner sanctum of greatness in his films? I'm going to propose something very, very simple. He likes people. He really loves people. He likes everyone. In some ways, for example, his definitive film is Early Summer, which he made in the early 1950s, which is about, it's mostly about this young woman who's going to be married off. But it also focuses on all her wider family, the parents, the grandparents, the young kids, and all of them have got an agenda. And Ozu treats those agendas as equal. He gives equal weight to all of them, even what the kids are up to. Their little games are just as important as what the grandfather wants, or what the young daughter of the family wants. And that's the key of Ozu. He likes everyone. He sees good and interest in all of them. Over in France, Jean Renoir is often quoted, isn't he? Everyone has their reasons. And we all quote that and say, this is a wonderful example of a filmmaker who's got a pluralist, Catholic idea of humanity, right? But actually, very few artists, I think, really love human beings in that way. Very few artists are capable of liking everyone. If you read many writers or watch filmmakers, they often segregate people off. There are people they clearly don't like, people they clearly demonise, people they clearly think have got the wrong ideas or the wrong philosophy or the wrong faith. It's very unusual to find an artist who actually really genuinely likes everybody. I don't think it's very common, and that's one of the main reason, I think, for Ozu's true greatness, both as a filmmaker and as an artist. Let's get into the top 10. It was very hard for me to pick a top 10 for Ozu because I've seen all of his excellent films, actually. That's nearly 50 movies. And I can honestly say all of them are excellent, and most of them are masterpieces. I think there's only one film that I fell a bit short. It's a weird comedy called The Lady and the Beard. But even that's of interest. It's kind of kooky and odd. Doesn't quite hit the mark, but it's still worth your time. Every single other film I've ever seen of his is brilliant in its own way. And there are loads of films that I wanted to choose and talk about. So, for example, The Flavour of Green Tea Over Rice, a much neglected Ozu film, which is one of the best portraits of a couple coming together after a split, after an acrimony between them. And it just follows them, the latter half of the movie follows them over an evening, renewing their friendship and eventually renewing their relationship. Beautiful film. I also, recently, I watched The Munakata Sisters. This is a film that Ozu himself disliked, partly because it was based on a novel, not his own original script. It's wonderful. It's a much more light-hearted, more comic film than we're used to from Ozu, but it's great. It's really good, with excellent central performances from Kinuyo Tanaka and Hideko Takamina, who are wonderful as two very different sisters. Highly recommended. In the whole way through Ozu's filmography, there's something to watch. But here are the 10 films that I picked out. Now, at number 10 is, I've cheated a little bit, a pair of films. In 1934, Ozu, this was in the late stages of his silent period, made a film called A Story of Floating Weeds. It's about the head of a sort of slightly daggy, down-at-heel theatrical troupe that toured the country. And he comes to this coastal town, and in this coastal town he knows that his illegitimate son, who he left many, many years ago, is alive. And he wants to see how the illegitimate son is doing while he's in disguise. It's a gorgeous film, and it shows all the qualities that Ozu brought to the silent movie. Wonderful acting. He remade it in the late 1950s. Pretty much exactly the same story, they're very similar movies. I'll confess to you that I prefer the remake for a very weak and shallow reason. The remake is in colour. And I think that Ozu is one of the great underrated colour directors. His colour films, which he made at the end of his career, are really beautiful. He made them in, I think it's called Agfa colour. And he's not an ostentatious colourist. He's a very subdued colourist, but the films are all the more beautiful for it. There's a particular shot in the remake of a boat coming into harbour with a bottle, a kind of Tarkovsky-esque bottle in the foreground. I've never forgotten that shot. It's so beautiful. In ninth place is an unusual film from Ozu that's very seldom spoken about, Early Spring, that he made in 1956. Now, this is one of a pair of films that Ozu made in the mid-50s. I think he made them as a kind of response to some criticism. This is just my personal theory, right? They're much tougher, harder films than we're used to from Ozu. The first of them is Tokyo Twilight. This is an urban film, often a dark film made at night, and it recalls Mikio Narusa and his more social realist commentary films than it does Ozu. It's a very good film, Tokyo Twilight, and it's often neglected. Early Spring, I think, is even better, and it's a film. It's got an unusual subject for Ozu. It's about a young professional couple who are having difficulties, both making ends meet and difficulties in their marriage, and he starts having an affair. It's interesting because the star is Ryo Ikebe, who you probably know better from Shinoda's film Pale Flower, where he plays a gangster. Very good film, Pale Flower, excellent film, from the later, Nouvelle Vague period. But Early Spring, really, if you've never come across it, it's a very, very good film and very neglected. I think it's one of Ozu's great movies. In eighth place, another oddball film in Ozu's filmography, A Hen in the Wind. Now, this is gives the lie to the idea that Ozu just wanted to paint a nice, cosy family idea of Japan. This is a hard-hitting movie. When I first saw it, I was blown away, right? First of all, there's the subject matter. It's about a guy coming back from the war to find that his wife, played by Kinuyo Tanaka, has prostituted herself to pay for her son's medicine or something. That's shocking enough, but what's really shocking, right, is there's a moment of violence. There's very little violence in Ozu, but there's a violent scene in this where the woman, Kinuyo Tanaka, gets pushed down the stairs. It's a really shocking moment. I remember seeing it at the cinema. I actually gasped. You don't expect that in any movie, but in an Ozu movie, it's like, and it just shows that Ozu was quite willing to deal with the realities of post-war Japan, in graphic form if he chose. He just chose not to. He chose to deal with it in a more subtle way. But A Hen in the Wind is an interesting insight into the fact that, Ozu was quite well aware of everything that was going on in Japan. And in seventh place, the last of this group of sort of, offbeat Ozu films that often get ignored, is Late Autumn, not to be confused with End of Summer. They came out right at the end of his career. They're both colour films, and I often get them confused myself. Late Autumn is a sort of remake of Late Spring, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. And it's basically a Marriage of the Daughter film. In Late Spring, an old widower played by Chishu Ryu feels that he needs to marry off his daughter. In that film, the daughter is played by Setsuko Hara. In this film, Setsuko Hara plays the mother of the daughter, who she feels needs to be married off. And she's aided in a rather odd way, by these three friends of her dead husband. It's not as sharp a film as Late Spring, but I think it's very beautiful. It's in a different register. It's slightly more comic. It's slightly more lighter, but with a sort of light melancholy running through it. It also is interesting because it gives a little performance to Mariko Okada. Those of you who are Yoshida fans, Kiju Yoshida fans, his wife who collaborated with him on his films in the 60s, and here she is in a young, early role. Please try Late Autumn. It often gets overlooked, but I actually think it's one of Ozu's best films. And don't let the comedy and the lightness of it deceive you. There's a lot going on under the surface. In sixth place, The Only Son. Now, Ozu like many Japanese directors, didn't take to sound. It took him nearly a decade after sound was introduced before he took it on board, but straight away he mastered it. The Only Son is one of the most moving films you will ever see. You know, Orson Welles said about Leo McCarey's film Make Way for Tomorrow, which is actually, incidentally, the blueprint for Tokyo Story. Not many people know this. It's about this old couple who find that through circumstances they're forced to live apart. And their children are not very sympathetic. And Orson Welles said about this film, it would make a stone cry. Well, I feel the same way about The Only Son. It's such a moving film. It's about this poor woman, a widow, who scrimps and saves to get her son into education. And later she visits him in Tokyo and finds that he's just a poor school teacher. It's a bravura piece of work, deeply moving, beautifully restrained, beautifully filmed. I can't imagine anyone not liking that film. In fifth place is Ozu's last film, An Autumn Afternoon. It's a testament film in so many ways, this movie, partly because the main character is Chishu Ryu, his favourite actor, a wonderful figure in Japanese film. And here he plays this sort of older businessman who's facing a lonely life. And one of his other partners is creating a new life with a much younger woman. This is a very, it's an autumnal film, An Autumn Afternoon. It's a very sad film. It's a film about getting old. But you see in this film, the moments, the sort of set-piece moments, they're not like a set-piece moment in a Spielberg film or a Brian De Palma film. They're very low-key, but they're so powerful. They go off like gunshots in your heart. There's an amazing sequence in a bar where he goes to this bar and the barman and him both served in the war, and they sing this song, this old soldier's song. It's so moving, especially the second time he goes back to the bar. And then there's this incredible moment. The film is building up to it, though you don't realise it. Ozu is so subtle you don't realise this is coming, but then it breaks on you like a tsunami. When Chishu Ryu turns to his friend and says, I find the fact that you're going out with that young woman quite disgusting. And then he walks away. Now, in any other film, that would be a minor moment. In an Ozu film, it's like there's been an earthquake. It's an incredible moment. I can't quite explain why. In fourth place is the film I was talking about earlier, Early Summer. The second part of the Noriko trilogy. The first part is Late Spring. The third part is Tokyo Story. I absolutely love this film, and for me it is the definitive Ozu film. Mostly because of the way it treats every single member of the family equally, with equal interest and equal weight. The main part of the story revolves around Noriko, played by Setsuko Hara, a magnificent actress with an incredible face who Ozu uses very often. One of the great faces, I think, in world cinema. But every member of the family, from the grandfather to the two kids, is of interest. For those of you who like Koreeda Hirogatsu, a modern Japanese director who's often compared to Ozu, I think Koreeda owes so much to this film. It's really kind of like the foundation stone of the whole of Koreeda's career, certainly his shomin-geki career. So if you're interested in Koreeda, you really must watch Early Summer. In third place, I've put Tokyo Story. You know what? I almost didn't put Tokyo Story in this top 10 because it's so well known and it's so admired. And it slightly irritates me because Tokyo Story is not appreciably better than Ozu's other work. It's not worse. It's a masterpiece. It's an absolutely incredible film. And the death of the mother is, I mean, I can barely speak. But it's extraordinary. But you know what? All of these films I've been discussing in this video are just as good. And they're just as strong an example of what Ozu does. So if you like Tokyo Story, for God's sake, watch these other movies, because you're missing out. You know, everything that you like in Tokyo Story is in those other films. So I'm not going to sit here and praise Tokyo Story. It is an absolute masterpiece, and still one of the greatest movies ever made, about the relationship between parents and children, especially as the parents grow older. In second place, I've cheated again, another pair of films. Early in the 1930s, during his silent phase, I think Ozu's greatest silent film is called I Was Born But ... He often had titles like that. I was a flunky but, or I graduated but, he did movies like this. A wonderful film about these two sort of rather anarchic kids who find out that their father is a bit of a toady. He's not this grand man that he imagined him to be. He's a bit of a toady to his boss, and he's not really a very important person. And they see him collapse in front of their eyes. It's a wonderful film. And it's totally on the side of the boys, and it picks up on their anarchic style in the way it's made. Now, this film is a great favourite of critics, and it's been praised to the skies. And because of that, the remake, again, that Ozu made in the late 50s, has been overshadowed completely. I think that's a bit of an injustice, right? I love I Was Born But, people like Jonathan Rosenbaum have, said it's the best Ozu film, or their favourite Ozu film. So Ohio, or Good Morning, which was made in 1959, has been sort of sidelined. We need to pull Ohio out of obscurity because it's a really great film. Now, in this film, it's not as anarchic as the previous film. It's got a similar plot. It's about two boys, and they just want their parents to buy them a TV, right? So it's a very 1950s film. Again, it's in this beautiful Agfacolor. It's a gorgeous looking film. It's so beautiful. But it's a much more downbeat, gentle, almost passive film, which is why I think some critics write it off. It's a film of an older man, right? Whereas I Was Born But is the film of a younger man. But I think it's a very great film. And again, I love the way that Ozu is interested in the agenda and the motivations of all of the family and all of the people in the movie. Check it out. It's a major late 50s masterpiece. But at number one, I've spoken about this film many times on this channel, I had to pick Late Spring, which he made in 1949. It's the start of the Noriko trilogy. Very simple story. An old professor, an old widower, has a young daughter, and they're very much in love. They have a very cosy, wonderful existence. But then members of the family say, you should be marrying her off. She needs a husband. And he gets guilty. He thinks, I'm not doing my duty as a father. So he starts to try and push her into marriage. And she takes that as a betrayal. And slowly their relationship starts to splinter. That's what I find so moving about the film. It's about two people who love each other, who through no fault of their own get split apart. And I don't think that subject has ever been so beautifully studied and examined. There's one shot in this film that those people who love the film will never ever forget. They're walking along and suddenly Setsuko Hara just walks across the road and he's left watching her. Very simple shot, one of the most devastating in film history. There's another shot that we need to talk about here. Late Spring is a very moving film where what I've talked about, this everyday setup, where suddenly a fissure, a tension is introduced and then that becomes overwhelming. It's never better explored than in this film. But Late Spring is also a very brave film in terms of its formal approach. There's a scene set in a Japanese, traditional Japanese theatre, where again, just the relationship of how people are sitting and their expression tells you so much. And then there's a very famous shot that a lot of people discussed in great detail at the end of the film, where the two of them, they're sort of reconciling to each other, the daughter and the father, and they spend a night at an inn. And they're lying there in the darkness. And she's crying, I think, if I remember rightly. And it keeps cutting in the darkness to an urn. There's no narrative reason for it. And it keeps cutting back to her. And it keeps cutting to the urn. It's a beautiful piece of poetic statement, lyricism, that breaks, the shell of the film. And I prefer to leave it unexplained in the sense that it's something you understand poetically and subconsciously. I don't think you have to sort of set it out. It will mean different things to different people in a different register. And then there's the final shot when he's lost her, she's been married off, and he's there alone and he's peeling an apple and he just bows his head. Late Spring It vies with Carl Dry's Audette as my favourite film of all time. I think it's absolutely exquisite. So those are my top 10 Ozu films. I love talking about this director, so I'd love to hear your comments below. Thanks very much.